Inside the Harrington Gala, the world had not yet decided how to react, but Emily Carter already knew they would react too late. Every step she took deeper into the hall felt like moving through a memory that belonged to someone else, yet no one dared to claim ownership of her presence. Jonathan Pierce remained frozen near the center, his attention locked on her with a confusion he could not hide, as if the face in front of him was familiar from conversations he never fully understood at the time. Around them, guests shifted their weight, adjusting their posture, lowering their voices, pretending not to stare while doing exactly that. Emily did not acknowledge any of it. Her expression remained steady, controlled, unreadable, as though the noise of the room had been placed behind thick glass. Somewhere across the floor, William Harrington finally turned fully toward her, and for a brief moment, his confidence did not follow him. It was not fear, not anger, but something more unsettling, the recognition of a past he had carefully organized out of sight, now standing directly under the chandelier light. He did not move forward. Neither did she. The space between them became a silent negotiation that neither of them initiated. Jonathan finally lowered his voice and asked someone nearby who she was, but the answer he received was fragmented, uncertain, filled with half-remembered stories and outdated assumptions. She used to be his wife, one guest said, as if that explanation was enough to contain her presence in the room. It was not, because Emily Carter no longer carried the shape of that memory. Months earlier, in a quiet office far removed from this world of marble and champagne, she had been building something no one here had seen coming. Late nights spent reviewing documents, early mornings filled with client calls, and a reputation slowly forming in industries that rarely remembered names like hers. She did not rebuild herself loudly. She rebuilt herself precisely. Every decision measured, every step intentional, and in that silence, she became something no one at this gala had prepared for. Jonathan's gaze shifted again, now sharper, as if trying to reconcile the woman standing in front of him with the unseen strategist he had once unknowingly relied on during a critical business negotiation months ago. At the time, he had never asked who guided him through it. Now the realization hovered just out of reach, waiting to complete itself. William Harrington finally took a step forward, not toward her, but into her path, as if testing whether the world still responded to his authority the way it used to. It did not. The room waited without instruction, and in that waiting, Emily's presence became the only certainty left. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. And as the chandelier light reflected softly across the polished floor, it became clear that tonight was not a return, but a correction of something the world had misunderstood for far too long. The silence inside the ballroom was no longer about surprise. It was about realization, the kind that spreads slowly when people understand they are no longer in control of the story unfolding in front of them. Emily Carter stood at the center of that silence without changing her posture, without acknowledging the pressure building around her name. Jonathan Pierce remained a few steps behind her line of sight, still processing fragments of memory that refused to align into something logical. He remembered now, not her face, but her influence, a presence behind decisions he once believed were entirely his own. Across the room, William Harrington finally spoke, his voice measured but no longer carrying the effortless dominance it once held in spaces like this. He addressed her name directly, as if saying it could re-establish order. "Emily, this is not the place for you," he said, and the words landed in the air with less authority than he intended. But Emily did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked past him, scanning the room not with emotion but with awareness, as if confirming something only she could see. The guests waited for her reaction, expecting disruption, expecting collapse, expecting something familiar. But Emily Carter had long stopped performing for expectations. She took one step forward, and that single movement changed the distance between past and present. Jonathan's expression tightened as another memory surfaced, this time sharper, undeniable. Months ago, during a confidential acquisition review, an anonymous consultant had corrected a critical valuation error that saved Harrington Global from a multi-million-dollar miscalculation. The correction had been precise, almost surgical, and the name attached to the correspondence had been unfamiliar at the time. Now, standing under the chandelier light, Jonathan understood that the same precision was standing in front of him. William attempted to speak again, but the attention of the room had already begun to drift away from him, not out of disrespect, but because something else had taken priority. Power, in its most visible form, was being quietly reassigned in real time. Emily's presence did not demand attention, it absorbed it. The guests who once defined status through proximity to William Harrington now found themselves recalibrating their perception, unsure of where they should stand, unsure of what they were allowed to believe. Jonathan finally stepped forward, not to interrupt, but to understand. His voice was lower now, careful. "We have met before, haven't we?" he said, though it sounded less like a question and more like a realization forming too late. Emily finally turned her eyes toward him, and for the first time since entering the gala, her expression softened slightly, not with recognition of him as a person, but with recognition of the moment itself. Because moments like this were never accidental. They were the result of time, patience, and decisions made far away from rooms like this. And as the room held its breath again, the truth hovering just beneath the surface began to feel less like a revelation and more like an inevitable correction waiting for its final reveal. The atmosphere inside the ballroom had shifted again, no longer just tension, but a fragile recalibration of everything the guests believed they understood about power and status. Emily Carter stood at the center of that recalibration without moving closer to anyone, as if proximity itself had lost meaning. Jonathan Pierce remained slightly behind her, his attention no longer divided but fully anchored, as pieces of past events aligned into a pattern he could not ignore. William Harrington, however, was no longer simply observing. He was calculating, attempting to restore control through presence alone, but the room no longer responded to him in the way it once had. He stepped forward again, this time more deliberately, and addressed Emily with a tone that tried to sound composed but carried a visible strain. "Whatever this is, it is not the place for personal history," he said, gesturing lightly toward the surrounding guests as if the room itself could support his position. But Emily remained still, her expression unchanged, as though his words had passed through an invisible boundary without impact. She finally spoke, her voice calm and precise, not raised, not defensive, but measured in a way that made the silence around her feel heavier. "You already decided what place I belong in a long time ago," she said, and the simplicity of the statement caused a subtle shift in the audience's attention. Jonathan's gaze tightened again, not at her words alone, but at the clarity behind them. It was not anger, it was definition. The kind of definition that does not ask for permission. Somewhere deeper in his memory, another connection surfaced. The anonymous strategist who had once guided him through a critical financial restructuring had used similar phrasing: direct, minimal, undeniable. At the time, he had assumed it was coincidence. Now coincidence no longer felt like a sufficient explanation. Across the hall, conversations that had once been carefully controlled began to fragment into speculation. Guests leaned closer to each other, voices lowering, names resurfacing, assumptions being questioned in real time. Emily did not react to any of it. Instead, she shifted her attention briefly toward Jonathan, acknowledging his presence fully for the first time. "You were part of a decision process once," she said, not as accusation, but as confirmation. Jonathan did not respond immediately, because the implication of her words was already forming its own answer. William attempted to intervene again, but the structure of the room no longer supported interruption. Even his presence felt slightly displaced, as if the environment had subtly reorganized around a different center of gravity. Emily took one slow step forward, not toward confrontation, but toward completion of something already in motion. The chandeliers above cast steady light across her path, illuminating every movement without distortion. And in that light, the distinction between past and present became less relevant than the undeniable fact that something long unseen was now fully visible. Jonathan finally spoke again, his voice lower, careful, almost reluctant. "I think I know who you are," he said, though the sentence felt incomplete even as it left his mouth. Emily did not confirm or deny it. She simply held his gaze for a brief moment longer than comfort allowed, and in that silence, the realization did not arrive as information, but as inevitability. The gala, once designed to celebrate influence and hierarchy, had begun to lose its original structure, not through disruption, but through exposure. And in that exposure, every assumption about where power resided began to quietly dissolve. The ballroom no longer felt like a celebration, but like a space quietly rearranging its own hierarchy in real time. And Emily Carter remained at the center of that invisible shift without ever raising her voice or changing her pace. Jonathan Pierce stood closer now than before, no longer observing from distance, but standing within the orbit of her presence, as if proximity might help him complete the unfinished pattern forming in his mind. William Harrington, however, had begun to lose the subtle confidence that once defined his presence in rooms like this. He adjusted his stance, then his expression, attempting to reclaim authority through composure alone, but the effect was no longer landing the way it used to. He spoke again, this time more controlled, addressing not only Emily but the room itself. "This gathering is not meant for revisiting private matters," he said, as if the structure of the event could still enforce boundaries around him. But Emily did not react to the framing. She simply looked at him, and in that look there was no emotion that the audience could easily categorize. It was not anger, not satisfaction, not hesitation. It was finality shaped by time. Jonathan's attention shifted between them, the distance between recognition and understanding shrinking with every second. The memory of the anonymous advisor resurfaced again, more sharply now, no longer fragmented. He recalled the precision of recommendations, the clarity of financial corrections that had seemed almost too accurate to come from any standard consulting team. At the time, he had attributed it to a specialized firm working behind layers of confidentiality. Now that explanation felt incomplete. William attempted once more to assert control over the moment, taking a small step forward and speaking in a lower tone meant only for her. "If this is about the past, we can address it elsewhere," he said. But even as he spoke, the words felt disconnected from the environment around him, as though the room was no longer reinforcing his authority. Emily finally shifted her attention fully to him, and the room seemed to quiet further, as if anticipating a correction rather than a response. "The past was already addressed," she said calmly, her voice steady enough that even those far from her could sense its precision. "You simply chose not to recognize it." The sentence did not carry force, but it carried structure, and that structure altered the atmosphere more effectively than volume ever could. Jonathan's expression changed subtly at those words, because they aligned too closely with what he had begun to realize on his own. The strategist behind those anonymous communications had never been incidental. Every instruction had carried intention, and every outcome had benefited from it in ways that were now impossible to ignore. Across the room, guests began to abandon their earlier assumptions, their conversations breaking into cautious reinterpretations of who Emily Carter might actually be in relation to the current financial and corporate landscape they all depended on. William sensed the shift, and for the first time, his response was not immediate. He looked at her as if trying to locate the version of her that once existed within his control, but the version standing before him no longer aligned with that memory. Jonathan finally stepped fully into the space between them, his voice no longer uncertain, but carefully measured. "You were the one guiding the restructuring strategy for Harrington Global," he said, and although phrased as a statement, it carried the weight of confirmation he was still processing. Emily did not confirm it with words. Instead, she gave a small, almost imperceptible pause, and that pause itself became the answer. In that moment, the structure of the evening completed its inversion. What had once been a controlled display of legacy and influence had become something else entirely, a quiet redistribution of recognition, where identity was no longer defined by titles or relationships, but by actions that had already shaped outcomes long before anyone in the room understood their origin. The silence inside the ballroom had deepened into something more structured, no longer just emotional tension, but a complete rearrangement of perception among everyone present. Emily Carter remained still at the center of it, as if the world around her was adjusting itself rather than she was moving through it. Jonathan Pierce stood now fully within her proximity, no longer searching for fragments of understanding, but assembling a conclusion that was becoming increasingly unavoidable. William Harrington, however, had reached a point where control was no longer something he could assert simply by presence. The room did not respond to him the way it once did, and that realization began to surface in subtle changes in his posture, in the hesitation between his words, in the way his authority no longer filled the space around him. He tried once more to speak, addressing Emily with a tone that attempted to re-establish distance. Whatever role you think you had in the past, it does not change the structure of this company or this family, he said, but even as the sentence ended, it felt like it belonged to an earlier version of the room, not the one that existed now. Emily finally shifted her gaze directly toward him, and when she spoke, there was no rise in emotion, only clarity. The structure you are referring to was already changing long before you noticed, she said, her voice calm enough that it carried through the surrounding silence without effort. Jonathan's attention sharpened further, because the phrasing aligned with something he had experienced firsthand during a confidential operational review months earlier. At the time, he had received guidance from an anonymous source that corrected multiple structural inefficiencies within Harrington Global's expansion strategy. Those corrections had not only stabilized key investments, but had redirected long-term projections in a way that significantly increased market positioning. He had never known who authored those directives, only that they were precise beyond standard consulting expectations. Now, standing in this room, that anonymity was no longer complete. William attempted to respond again, but the interruption he expected from the room never came. Instead, there was hesitation among the guests, a collective uncertainty about where attention should now be placed. The shift was subtle but irreversible. Emily took a slow step forward, not toward confrontation, but toward completion of something already unfolding. You built your understanding of control on visibility, she continued, her voice steady and composed. But influence does not require visibility. It requires execution. The words were not delivered as accusation, but as definition, and definitions carry a different kind of weight in spaces like this. Jonathan finally spoke again, this time without hesitation in tone, though still processing the implications forming in real time. The restructuring model that saved our international division was attributed to a consulting consortium, he said, then paused briefly before continuing. But there was no consortium. It was you. The statement settled into the room with a quiet finality. Emily did not confirm it verbally, but she did not deny it either. Her expression remained unchanged, as if acknowledgement was unnecessary for something already proven through outcome. Across the hall, conversations that had once been centered on legacy and lineage began to fracture into reassessment. Guests who had once measured influence through proximity to William Harrington were now recalibrating their understanding based on a presence they had previously dismissed. William stood still, no longer attempting to interrupt, as if recognizing that interruption itself no longer held function in this moment. Jonathan looked at Emily with a level of focus that had shifted from curiosity to realization. If what you are saying is true, he said carefully, then everything we assumed about the last fiscal year was shaped by your decisions. Emily held his gaze for a brief moment before replying, her tone unchanged. Assumption is what created instability. Correction is what resolved it. And in that sentence, the entire evening stopped feeling like an encounter and began feeling like an unveiling of a structure that had already been in motion long before anyone in the room had been aware of its existence. The ballroom had reached a point where silence was no longer empty, but structured, as if every person inside it had collectively agreed to stop pretending they understood what came next. Emily Carter stood at the center of that stillness without moving, her presence no longer interpreted as surprise, but as confirmation of something long overlooked. Jonathan Pierce remained close enough now that every shift in her expression felt immediate, yet his attention was not emotional anymore. It was analytical, as if he was finally reading a document he had signed months ago without realizing its full meaning. William Harrington, however, had entered a phase where authority no longer responded to intention. His presence still filled the space, but it no longer shaped it. The guests were no longer reacting to him in the same predictable rhythm, and that absence of response began to alter his composure in subtle but visible ways. He tried again to assert himself, addressing Emily directly, his tone controlled but increasingly disconnected from the environment around him. You are standing in a space that does not belong to you, he said, as if repetition could restore structure. But Emily did not acknowledge the framing of ownership. She simply looked at him with a calm that carried no resistance because it did not need to resist anything. Belonging is not defined by permission, she said evenly. It is defined by impact. Jonathan's focus tightened further at those words, because they aligned too precisely with what he had begun to understand about the restructuring phase his company had undergone. The decisions that had stabilized volatile markets, redirected failing acquisitions, and repositioned international assets had all carried the same signature pattern: precise, minimal, irreversible. At the time, he had assumed it was institutional intelligence operating behind layers of advisory networks. Now that assumption was dissolving in real time. William attempted to interrupt the direction of the conversation again, but the room no longer responded to his attempts to redirect attention. Instead, attention continued to drift toward Emily, not because she demanded it, but because she had already shaped outcomes that everyone else was still trying to interpret. Jonathan finally stepped forward into full clarity, his voice steady but no longer uncertain. The operational corrections during the last 2 fiscal quarters, he said carefully. They were not external recommendations, were they? Emily did not answer immediately. Instead, she allowed the question to exist in the space between them, where realization could form without assistance. That silence became its own confirmation. Jonathan exhaled slightly, not in disbelief anymore, but in recognition of scale. You were inside the system, he continued, as if speaking the conclusion aloud helped stabilize it. Not as a consultant, as the source. Across the room, William's expression tightened, not in anger, but in recalculation, as if attempting to reassign meaning to events that no longer fit within his framework of control. Emily shifted her gaze briefly across the room, observing not individuals but the structure they represented, and when she spoke again, her tone remained unchanged. Systems do not change from the outside alone, she said. They change when someone understands them well enough to correct them from within. Jonathan's understanding settled deeper at that point, because it explained not only the financial restructuring, but also the absence of traceable attribution. Every correction had been embedded directly into operational flow, executed through channels that appeared ordinary until their results became undeniable. William finally spoke again, but his voice no longer carried the same certainty it had at the beginning of the evening. Even if what you are implying is true, he said slowly, it does not change the structure of this company or its leadership. Emily looked at him for a longer moment this time, and when she responded, her voice carried the same calm precision that had already redefined the atmosphere around her. Structure is not permanent, she said. It only remains until something more accurate replaces it. And in that moment, without any visible disruption, the understanding inside the room shifted again, not through confrontation, but through the quiet recognition that the foundation they had all relied upon was no longer being interpreted the same way. The atmosphere inside the ballroom had reached a point where silence no longer felt like absence, but like agreement, as if everyone present had unconsciously accepted that the rules they once relied on were no longer functioning in the same way. Emily Carter stood at the center of that collective uncertainty without changing her posture or expression, her calm presence continuing to redefine the emotional temperature of the room. Jonathan Pierce remained close enough now that even the smallest shifts in her focus carried meaning, and his understanding of her identity was no longer forming as speculation, but as confirmation layered over prior experience. William Harrington, however, was no longer engaging the room with confidence. His authority still existed in name, but it no longer produced immediate response, and that gap between expectation and reaction began to expose a structural weakness he could not easily correct. He spoke again, this time attempting a more direct appeal to order, addressing not only Emily but the guests as well. This is still a controlled environment, he said, as if reminding the room of its intended design could restore its former hierarchy. But Emily did not acknowledge the framing of control. Instead, she allowed the silence to remain intact before responding, her voice steady and precise. Control is only recognized when people agree to follow it, she said. Jonathan's attention tightened further, because the statement aligned too closely with what he had observed during the financial restructuring phases he had once attributed to anonymous advisory support. Every correction that had stabilized his operations had functioned not through force, but through precision that rendered resistance unnecessary. William attempted once more to redirect attention toward his position within the company, but even as he spoke, the room's focus continued to drift away from him, as if his role had been gradually reassigned without formal announcement. Emily took a slow step forward, not toward confrontation, but toward completion of something already unfolding beneath the surface of the evening. Jonathan finally broke the silence with a carefully measured question. "The restructuring of our international assets," he said, pausing briefly as if confirming his own understanding before continuing. "That was not initiated by any external consulting group, was it?" Emily did not answer immediately. Instead, she allowed the question to exist fully in the space between them, where its implication could settle without assistance. That pause itself became the answer. Jonathan's expression shifted subtly, not into shock, but into alignment, as fragments of prior events finally connected into a coherent structure. "It was you," he said quietly, not as accusation, but as recognition. Across the room, William's gaze sharpened, but there was a noticeable absence of immediate rebuttal, as if the usual mechanisms of dismissal were no longer sufficient to counter what was becoming evident. Emily finally turned her attention fully toward Jonathan, acknowledging his understanding without altering her composure. "Information is only as effective as the system that carries it," she said. "I did not change outcomes by being visible. I changed them by being accurate." The clarity of her words settled into the room with a weight that did not require emphasis. Guests who had previously measured influence through visibility and title began to reassess what they were witnessing in real time. The realization was no longer confined to Jonathan alone. It was spreading through the room in layers, each person recalculating assumptions about decisions they had believed were externally driven, but were now being reframed as internally designed. William finally attempted to reassert himself one more time, his voice lower but still controlled. "Even if your involvement explains past adjustments, it does not redefine current leadership or ownership," he said. Emily met his gaze steadily, and when she spoke again, her tone carried the same calm precision that had been present from the beginning of the evening. "Leadership is not redefined by declaration," she said. "It is redefined by result." And in that moment, the distinction between perceived authority and actual influence became unmistakably visible to everyone in the room, as the structure they had assumed to be fixed revealed itself to be something far more fluid, already shaped by forces they were only now beginning to understand. The ballroom no longer felt like a gathering built on celebration, but like a system undergoing quiet collapse and reorganization at the same time, where every person inside it was forced to confront the possibility that what they believed about power had been incomplete from the beginning. Emily Carter stood at the center of that shifting reality without changing her posture or expression, her calm presence no longer interpreted as surprise or disruption, but as final confirmation of a truth that had already been acting in the background long before anyone noticed. Jonathan Pierce remained near her, no longer searching for explanations, but accepting that the explanations he had relied on were fragments of a larger structure he had never seen in full. William Harrington, however, was now facing something different from opposition. He was facing irrelevance within the very space he once defined. His voice, when he spoke again, carried less certainty than before, though he still attempted to frame the situation in terms that would preserve hierarchy. "This conversation has gone far enough," he said, trying to reassert procedural control over an environment that was no longer responding to procedural logic. But Emily did not respond to the attempt at limitation. Instead, she remained still for a moment, allowing the silence to complete itself before speaking. "What you are calling a conversation," she said calmly, "has already been resolved in practice." Jonathan's focus tightened further, because the phrasing mirrored what he had begun to understand through accumulated evidence rather than sudden realization. Every adjustment in Harrington Global's structure over the past year had already reflected decisions that were not attributed to any visible authority, yet had consistently produced measurable stability. William attempted to respond again, but the room no longer oriented itself around his input. Even his presence felt secondary, as if the environment had already shifted its center of gravity elsewhere. Emily finally took a step forward, not toward confrontation, but toward conclusion. Jonathan spoke again, this time with a clarity that no longer carried hesitation. The restructuring protocols that affected our entire international portfolio, he said, pausing briefly as the final connection formed in his understanding. They were not external advisories. They were authored internally. Emily's gaze shifted toward him, acknowledging the accuracy of his conclusion without needing to confirm it verbally. That silence carried more weight than any explicit statement could have produced. Across the room, guests who had once measured authority through position and proximity began to recalibrate their understanding of influence itself, recognizing that what they had assumed to be stable leadership structures had already been quietly redirected by unseen precision. William's expression tightened again, but this time there was no immediate attempt to counter the statement, because the framework he relied on no longer provided effective resistance. Emily finally spoke again, her tone unchanged, steady, and precise. Visibility was never the source of change, she said. It only delayed recognition of it. Jonathan exhaled slowly, not in disbelief, but in acceptance of scale, as the realization settled into its final form. The anonymous systems he had once trusted to stabilize risk were not external interventions at all. They were deliberate, internal corrections executed with such consistency that they had been mistaken for coincidence or institutional intelligence. William took a small step back, not in retreat, but in recalibration, as if trying to locate a version of the room where his authority still functioned as it once did. But that version no longer existed. Emily turned slightly, her attention now encompassing the entire ballroom rather than any individual presence within it. Structures only appear permanent until they are measured accurately, she said, her voice steady enough that it did not require emphasis. And in that final statement, the distinction between perceived control and actual influence dissolved completely for everyone present, leaving behind a quiet recognition that what they had witnessed was not a confrontation, but a correction that had already been completed long before the evening began.